Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session. My name's Joe. I'm going to be the technical manager for today. And we're really excited to welcome you to this learning lab on quantifying the environmental impacts of feeding commercial infant formula with the green feeding tool, led by Julie Smith of the Australian National University and colleagues who she will introduce. Thanks for taking part in the Academy Week this year in the Learning Lab program. I hope you've signed up to many things happening this week. So without further ado, I'd like to say thanks again to our organisers of this session, and I'll hand over to Julie Smith. Over to you.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you to all your team that are supporting us today. And good day, everybody, and thanks for joining this learning lab. My name is Julie Smith. I'm an honorary associate professor at the Australian National University, and with me and my team is Duan Nguyen, who's coming from Vietnam, and Andini Pramono, who's here with me at the Australian National University. So we're going to just give a bit of an outline of the objectives for this session. Next slide, please. And what we hope you'll achieve from the next couple of hours. So firstly, we're going to discuss the environmental impacts of infant feeding of commercial milk formula. We're going to use the green feeding tool to generate data. We will engage in discussions about climate change, and we're going to learn how to apply the knowledge that we've gained to advocate for potential policy changes. So the structure of the session is, as you can see on the screen. First of all, we're going to have a little bit of an icebreaker. Duan will give a brief introduction, and then I will introduce you to the tool and the context for it. We will have a demonstration from Duan. We'll do some practice, which is always good to do, and some case studies, using some case studies. We will, after you've been in groups and practiced together, we'll ask you to do a group presentation, and then we'll have Q&A. And beyond that, you'll have to wait and see what's next. So over to you, Duan.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. So, and good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. So, it's my pleasure to be in this learning lab. So, I would like to firstly introduce about the NOVA food classification. So, actually, you are working in the field of agriculture, nutrition, and health. You are all very familiar with this concept. So basically, they will try to divide the food, classify the food into 4 groups, from unprocessed or minimally processed food to the higher level to ultra-processed food. And look at certain illustration. You might also see that the one on the left is kind of healthy, and the one on the right actually is not healthy. So for this poll, you could also scan your smartphone to scan the barcode, or maybe you could click on the link to in the chat box. So try to answer yourself, how is chromosome milk formula classified within the NOVA food classification? Yeah, so we could have 4 groups corresponding to the one that's kind of indicate in the NOVA classification. Yeah. So actually, that's really interesting, like observation, and I believe that's even like many people even like consider like they're kind of the thing for coming from breast milk, but actually it's not. So let me go back to the slide. Okay, so you know that ultra-processed food is not healthy, and actually unprocessed or minimum processed actually is animal milk. Sometimes, many times it's pasteurized or using like certain level of short-term treatment. And actually, this milk could used for children from 6 months, even 6 months onward. So they don't really need to use expensive infant formula. However, many other things like become powder, they could be considered like ultra-processed food. This is including milk for infant, for toddler, and many times it's special milk, and also many times actually in many have many other options of milk as well. So I also see a lot of promotion milk for pregnant women or lactating women, and also from many other group as well. So many times because of the promotion, people kind of they tend to misunderstanding about this aspect, and yeah, and that's become very dangerous.
So babies need breastfeeding and human milk for appropriate growth and development. But many people don't realise that mothers need it too. Mothers' reproductive health is also benefited by breastfeeding, as it protects or reduces the risk of breast cancer, cervical cancer, and a range of reproductive cancers, as well as diabetes and preconditions for heart disease. A range of evidence points to commercial milk formula and its marketing as an important driver of the global epidemic of obesity and current disease and chronic disease. Breastfeeding is increasingly well recognised as a double duty nutrition action, both reducing undernutrition and overnutrition. But also is a triple duty action in terms of addressing the global syndemic of nutrition, health, and sustainability. So let's talk a little about the environment, climate change, and infant and young child feeding. The three pillars of policy in relation to climate change are mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. Breastfeeding addresses all three of those policy pillars. By contrast, milk formula has environmental as well as health cost externalities. In 2019, I wrote about what this climate change policy framework means for policies on infant and young child feeding, and you may like to have a look at that open access paper. Next slide, please. On adaptation, briefly, is maladaptive to climate change. A population that has high breastfeeding rates is better placed to adapt to climate change risks. Breastfeeding provides adaptive nutrition, fluids, and responsive care, strong immune responsivity, and optimal organ development. Next slide, please. Breastfeeding is also relevant to population level resilience, meaning being prepared for crisis. Children who are reliant on commercial milk formula are more vulnerable to climate-related crises like food supply disruptions, falling agricultural productivity, and rising food prices. In emergencies and disasters, formula-reliant babies suffer particularly from food scarcity, lack of water, lack of electricity. But what we'll talk about today, mostly, is mitigation. The environmental impacts of commercial milk formula are substantial. So I'm going to the effects on greenhouse gas emissions, but we'll also talk about water. So this slide shows you the simple message that commercial milk formula is not good for the environment. But you can see up here the life cycle of milk formula product, starting off in the fields on dairy farms where the cows generate the milk, milk that they would otherwise feed to their babies, and ending when it goes into the houses and the apartments of the people who find they need to use it for various reasons. So infant formula generates between 8 and 14 kilograms of, between 8 and 14 kilogram per kilogram of powder of greenhouse gas emissions. So every kilograms of emissions. The amount of formula needed to fully feed an infant for 6 months is between about 20 and 21 kilograms of powder. And this generates about 250 kilograms of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emissions, a quarter of a tonne. The amount of water needed to make infant formula or any sort of commercial milk formula is also very high. It's made from cow's milk or similar, which is well known to be a high greenhouse gas emitting product. The water use in this life cycle is more than 5,000 litres per kilogram over the product life cycle, mostly during the production stages of milk powder because of the need for the water for the cows and for the processing in the factory in a clean and hygienic way. Also, country example, a study of 3 North American countries found that emissions associated with sale of milk formula products in Canada, Mexico, and the United States average 59 kilograms of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gases per child aged 0 to 3 years. Another study that I was involved in estimated the greenhouse gas emissions for 6 Asian countries: Australia, South Korea, China, India, and the Philippines. And that study highlighted that there is a huge contribution of growing up formulas or follow-up formula products. Around half or more of the carbon footprints of commercial milk formula products are from growing up, so-called, and follow-up baby formula products. As Duan mentioned, these products are stated by the World Health Organization to be unnecessary and potentially harmful to child nutrition and health. So the research that I just outlined underpinned development of the green feeding tool. Our latest publication That was our first publication on this topic, but our latest publication, next slide please, Duan, explains the full process and workings of the green feeding tool. We've also recently published papers in the Bulletin of the World Health Organization, which propose that investments in breastfeeding protection, promotion and support be considered as a carbon offset in global funding schemes. So this diagram summarises the basic design, the process of design, and the way we approached the development of the tool and how we improve it. So we start off by defining what we're trying to achieve, what measurement data is available, what are the development options. We think about in which is a different one, we tested predictive models, and we verified the tool both against previous research, and we tested its usability and against the knowledge and experience of various stakeholders. So the green feeding tool focuses on breastfeeding practices among infants aged less than 6 months. It looks at the scientific evidence that I've mentioned to calculate the carbon and the water footprints. It can also calculate scenarios, such as the impacts of interventions or policy environments on carbon or water footprints. So what you see here is what you will see inside the tool. So when you first enter the tool, you first open the tool, you'll see the various options that you have there. There is an introduction, there are basic instructions, and lead you through. You'll choose the country or collection of countries that you want to look at, and it will generate results as you see here. It's flexible, so users can enter their own data for a particular country if it's not available within the tool, or they can scale it down to local levels. For example, you might want to look at what's happening in your province. So if you have the number of births for that province, then you can enter that data in for yourself. Or if your own country doesn't have suitable data, like many high-income countries don't, if you find a good, reliable study to generate that information, you can enter that yourself. It also allows adjustments to estimated impacts for any programs that you need to put in place to ensure adequate nutrition for mothers in that locality. So here are some of the results generated by the tool. Most of the countries in the data set that's preloaded into the tool are lower or middle income countries, mainly because high income countries don't collect sufficient quality data in most cases. In low and middle income countries alone, the use of dairy milk formula for infants alone, aged less than 6 months, results in annual carbon footprints of around 6 to 7 billion kilograms a year. This is equivalent to around 2 million cars on the road every year. 318 million trees would have to be planted to absorb this. Water used during the product life cycle is around 2.6 trillion litres, which is equivalent to 1 million Olympic swimming pools. So I'll now hand over to Duan for a demonstration of the green feeding tool and how it works. But
maybe okay, so for the demonstration, so we will there have two options. So we could type green feeding tool .org, or maybe use it in your the barcode. So let me give the demonstration. Okay, so when we log in, then we one page, a bit of introduction, and then there are 3 tabs like the calculate, use your own data, and the resources and feedback. So the one that I would like to give the demonstration actually is the calculate first. So as Dr. Julie mentioned, so for the country that have the data, we could use this estimation. So when you click on calculate, that's when allows you to select a country. Probably let me Bangladesh, for example. So when you click on the country that have the data, so you will see here. So they will have like breastfeeding practice. So by the certain age group and overall for children under 6 months. So we have like based on the either mix or the EHS data, we could divide the children into like 3 feeding pattern. So first, exclusive or predominant breastfeeding. Partial breastfeeding, it means that they could have some milk formula, and then not breastfeeding, and we assume that if not, they will use infant formula because it's only under 6 months. So the reason we have exclusive or predominant breastfeeding, because predominant breastfeeding, it means that they only give the water only in addition to breast milk. So we consider that they will not consume formula milk. So that's go to the justification that Dr. Julie Smith mentioned. And then if you go further down, you will see the estimate. So from here, we could also have the age in month, so by 2 months interval and overall. And the lost milk, probably Dr. Julie Smith will talk a bit about more, but then here we are talking more about the carbon and water footprint. So based on the certain lower and upper estimation of the that Dr. Julie mentioned, so we could have the lower and upper estimate for the carbon footprint. And then we also have water footprint here. So now if you go to use your own data, so for many countries, if they have the data, probably going back to Bangladesh again, so if they have the available data, so they have the preloaded data, and then so however they could enter your own data. So for example, if I mentioned, so if you could go to probably 90, 80, no, 90% here, and 8% and 2% for example. And then if you could go to like extreme, like 99% and 1% and 0% here. So old data or counterfactual data, actually they are kind of about the same, but old data we tend to have like, if they have a newer data, and counterfactual data is the one that we think that's the one that we want. However, as mentioned, the equation could be very similar. So so here you need to be sure that it should sum up to 100%. Yeah, so and after that we hit calculate, and below that will be kind of a summary about the data that we enter. And here is the information about the carbon and water footprint associated with the preference that we have entered. So you can see that you can see like at the original, that's kind of 67 to 85 million kilogram of CO2 equivalent. However, if you could improve the breastfeeding practice to 90%, 8 and 2, so you could reduce the carbon footprint to a lot, to only 30 to 39, and not the same with water footprint. And for extreme scenarios, as you could see, that okay, they could even go to almost zero, very or no emission, as you could see it here. So we could have the chance to use the case study to evaluate this estimate. So basically, you could enter whatever. For example, if they don't have the data, or if they have a newer data, you could enter it here in the old data. Or maybe you expect, for example, if a certain intervention that could increase the breastfeeding to a certain level, you could also have certain assumption here, and you could come up with a number. And in the case study, we estimate the number and subtract to see how the improvement. I also see like very interesting feature here is actually you could select the mode, for example, the dark or white, depend on your preference. And you could select the language. I don't know, maybe I choose, maybe I select French, maybe any language, maybe Finland, for example. That will go to the translation and everything will be translated. So we use Google Translate to do this task. Many times, maybe it's not like beautiful language, but at least understandable language. Yeah. So for example, it's in Myanmar, Burma. So this is a certain thing that we could have. So if we go, and then we also have certain option like for giving the feedback. We also could have like a lot of resources here that we could you could also refer to. So with that, I don't know whether in the participant, do you have any question before we move on? In the case study, you will try to practice the same thing and go with the case study. Yeah.
Thank you, Tuan. So we've learned about the carbon and water footprint of the infant and young child feeding practices, comparing commercial milk formula with exclusive breastfeeding for infants aged 0 until 6 months. And Tuan has demonstrated the green feeding tool. Now we're going to practice using the GFT ourselves. So you will be divided into 3 smaller groups, and then you will be given a case study to work on. And within this case study, you can try to use the green feeding tool and also complete the table, and then reflect on potential uses of these findings, of your findings, and then how you might communicate these findings to different audiences.
So what we're planning to do in this session is now for people to talk about their experience using the tool. So group 2, we seem to manage it, didn't? Oh, did your group all have a chance? We didn't finish our case study. We ran out of time. But Andini, did your group finish the case study?
Yes, actually, yes. We finished the completing the table, yes. But then we have one, but probably for the question number 2, probably potential uses. One of my participants have really interesting reflection that I would like to invite to speak in the forum if there's time for it, Julie.
Okay, well, what I'd like to do now is ask someone from your group to speak about your experience, both as individuals and then in terms of the case study, which was number 1, case study number 1. Is that right? So do you have someone from that group that would like to speak on that?
Probably Eva. I would like to invite Eva.
Yeah, okay, I think once we found all the information on the tool, it was quite straightforward to fill out the numbers. But then we were talking about what they mean, and the last question, which came from who was it? I don't remember. Fesho, that we were missing like a cutoff or some relative values to know what does it mean to have such a footprint now. So there was the question, is there a cutoff? And I was thinking, is there a cutoff, for example, for a country specific assumption of exclusive breastfeeding percentage that is medically needed? Like this would be to put it into the relation. I don't know if there's a global figure for this to know, okay, how many % of the babies on average do need formula to put this into the relation, because we were discussing a little bit that what I also put in the chat before, to know how much of this is probably due to market pressure of the companies, or due to decisions of the families, and not due to medical issues. And one idea was also that then we could look at the formula need below, above 2 years of age, because this is even less indicated. But still there's babies, or there's children with issues like malformations that would need formula to be fed.
Great question. Yeah. It's traditionally been a figure floating around that perhaps up to 5% of children may need medically indicated supplementation in the early days. But the case of Norway, where they have a good network of human milk banks and strong policy support for breastfeeding, their experience has been 90% can get breastfeeding going. And if you look through the tool, I don't know which country specifically, but I know there are a number of countries in South Asia, especially, that have very high breastfeeding rates. Even Norway has 80% breastfeeding at 6 months. I think India and a number of other countries have continued breastfeeding at rates of 80%, 70, 80%. So with the right support, it's a very small number. If you look at the lost milk component that's calculated by the tool for the 0 to 6 months age group, that's based on the Norwegian experience, which is that 98% of mothers can breastfeed successfully with the right support.
But milk banks is also a factor.
I think the milk banks are a factor, because if you give a baby human milk rather than commercial milk formula, it won't displace breastfeeding to the same extent, because the cow's milk formula will have quite experience as a breastfeeding counsellor, is that if you give a baby 50 or 100 ml of formula, it will displace more than 50 to 100 ml of breast milk. So countries that have milk bank networks to support those mothers who are struggling, perhaps in the early days, will probably have higher rates of successful initiation. But the key thing is actually not milk banks, it's having the right support, skilled and experienced support from either their family, knowledgeable family members, or from skilled and experienced health professionals. I was thinking also what you were saying about some sort of benchmark in another sense. And if you look in the introduction to the tool, there's also information about how to benchmark those figures using the EPA calculator. So if you want to translate the numbers that you get for a country into Olympic swimming pools or car miles driven, and you're prepared to use the American averages for car miles, for example, then that EPA calculator is linked in the introduction. And that's a different form of benchmark, but people often, I personally find the numbers staggering, and it's helpful to actually get a bit of a perspective on them from how many car miles driven or how many trees needed to absorb and so on. So we should perhaps move on to, is there anything else you wanted to say from that group? Is anyone else from group 1 that wanted to talk about the experience, the results you got from the tool? Any questions you have about that? So Andini, would you like to summarise the experience of Group 1, and then we'll move on to Group 2?
I think basically it's pretty simple to complete the table. And yeah, just the finding the reflections from Eva is really interesting for me as well. So I guess it's really good to have it discuss it in the main room. So yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for those contributions. That was great. Cynthia has asked for clarification on the lost milk column. So really that's to allow a comparison with the mother's milk tool, which we haven't yet talked about. But if you search for the mother's milk tool, you'll find that it calculates the amount of milk produced by women for the 0 to 36 months. It's slightly different, but similar. And the lost milk calculation allows us in the green feeding tool to look more precisely at the milk that's lost for the 0 to 6 months age group. And the way that lost milk is calculated is to assume that 98% of women potentially are biologically able to breastfeed, and to compare that with the actual milk age group in that country. And so the lost milk is the milk that's not produced because of lack of support for breastfeeding and all the things that hinder women reaching the biological potential. And that will include lack of maternity leave, poor maternity care, lack of knowledge, marketing, and so on. So I hope that answers your question, Cynthia. I think it was Cynthia. So let's quickly go to Group 2, which was the one that I was in. We had great diversity of people from India, Ghana, Zimbabwe, Indonesia, the UK, South Africa, Pakistan. I think I've got everybody there. Now, would anybody from Group 2 like to tell us a little bit about your experience? I know I talked quite a bit with Kingsley, who's struggling with internet connection. And we also had other people that popped up in that group that were quite surprised, and I could say shocked in the UNICEF data for their country. So anyone from Group 2 that would like to speak up?
Yeah, so using the tool was very easy. It's very user-friendly. Just plug in your figures and you get a nice table going. But I also noticed that you can, when you're inputting your own data, if you toggle around with the counterfactual data, you can actually generate like a best case scenario, so that those benchmark figures people are asking about, you can create scenarios based on what you were saying, to say that if like 95% of women were breastfeeding exclusively and only 5%, were not breastfeeding, what would the output be like? So you can make comparisons on your own. What I did like was that the data is referenced. So you mentioned the mix and DHIS, so you can always go back to get the raw data from those sources. But other uses that I was just playing around with my head, would be nice to compare the trends from over the years for each country, to see if it's increasing or decreasing. And it'd also be interesting to compare the investment by breastfeeding and infant formula manufacturing companies, and how then that sort of affects the figures you'll be seeing, or how that relates to the figures of breastfeeding practices, and the carbon footprint you'll be seeing in the different countries. So yeah, that was just something I was thinking about. But I was also curious about high income countries, why there isn't that much data available, as you mentioned earlier. That's it from my side.
Thank you. There's some very insightful comments there, and In terms of the first question about the activity or the investment made by the companies, I take it that a company will invest 10 to 15% of their turnover in marketing. And so in Australia, for example, I know the numbers there that about the turnover of milk formula for all ages is around $1 billion a year. So one can suppose from that about 100 million to 150 million is invested every year by the companies in reducing breastfeeding. The government, to my knowledge, spends a lot less than that, and you can make the estimates from your own country. What was the second, sorry, I've forgotten the second part of your question or your comment there.
I have also started to think about my own question. Yeah, I think that was it. The other one I was just commenting on being able to get the raw data from, DHIS and mix, and also being able to compare trends over time by just, comparing years of the different data sets. Yeah.
Yeah. So we didn't upload the data from. We only upload the most recent data sets from UNICEF into the tool. It would make it too slow if we did it longer, but you can use the counterfactual, as Lorna found out, to look at how it's changed over time. And we are looking at developing, if we can get the funding, we're looking at developing an add-on that might actually directly input data on formula sales. At the moment, the tool uses the DHS and the mixed data, the UNICEF data sets. The high-income countries don't collect that data, presumably because they don't think breastfeeding is important in their country. But I think the recent research showing the impact on chronic diseases and, both in the mother and the child, I mentioned breast cancer and so on, chronic diseases really should increase the priority of high-income countries as well to monitor and measure what's going on with infant and young child feeding, because I've done studies in my own country in Australia, and around between about 10 and 25% of current chronic disease of various categories in Australia is attributable statistically to lack of proper feeding during the 1960s, when virtually all babies were formula fed. So there's a lot of things you can do to play with this data. So what we're going to do next is to ask you to think about what you would use, how you would use the green feeding tool, what you think you might be able to use it for. So we'll invite you to go to this web page, put in that number and type it in, and then we'll share it in the group. So these are the uses, the multiple uses of the green feeding tool. It can quantify and make visible, which is a big problem for breastfeeding. We don't have a Mother's Milk Incorporated out there marketing mother's milk. So quantifying and making visible the contribution of breastfeeding to children's health, to the planetary health, to the food system, as a food supply for children. It's really important to make that visible. It's also, we can use it to track progress, as one of our participants tonight has pointed out. We can compare countries, we can compare progress over time, and it can inform the updating of policies and programs. So policymakers can use it to judge how well they're going, whether their programs are working, whether their policies are working, what results they can expect for them when they introduce a new policy. And for people in the community and policymakers, researchers, it can help evidence-based advocacy for breastfeeding and for safe infant feeding. for children who aren't breastfed, and can motivate and be used to argue for greater investments in breastfeeding. I've done it takes time for women to breastfeed. Women invest in breastfeeding, and we really need society and governments to invest in it as well. It shouldn't be just the burden on women. It's not only their responsibility, it's all in the community to support them. So finally, it can also motivate the mother herself. I mean, women will make their decisions based on what their situation is and what their own priorities are. And that, depending on their circumstance, they may not decide to continue breastfeeding. But it will help. For some women, it'll be part of their motivation to know that they are helping protect the health of the planet as well as their baby. For some women, that will make the difference between a day when they introduced formula, a difficult day perhaps, and choosing not to introduce formula. So the decisions are very complex. There are multiple factors, but the environmental aspect can be motivating for some women on a difficult day. So a number of interventions have proven effective in increasing breastfeeding rates, including paid maternity leave, as you've seen. Interventions also include countries that adopt and enforce the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes, and also promoting the Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative, which reduces the distribution of formula through hospital systems, and through implementing the 10 steps to successful breastfeeding as part of their maternity care practices. And interventions that also known to work include providing more and better counselling to mothers, whether that be from their own family members who know well and have experience in breastfeeding, or whether it be skilled, trained and experienced health professionals. So we invite you to join us in utilising these tools to advocate for promoting breastfeeding, improving nutrition and health status, and building a better food environment for infants and young children and for their mothers and their families. So to conclude now, the current expansion of markets for commercial milk formula is a maladaptive response for climate change. Commercial milk formula has substantial carbon and water footprints. Breastfeeding is the healthy and sustainable food system for infants and young children and for the planet, and must be protected from company marketing, which undermines confidence in exclusive breastfeeding, undermines confidence in continued breastfeeding, and promotes commercial milk formula use, which increases demand and increases, as we've seen, the greenhouse gas emissions and water use. So the green feeding tool quantifies breastfeeding as a crucial element in building a healthy and sustainable food system. It allows breastfeeding interventions to be advocated as a carbon offset initiative under global funding facilities, such as the Clean Development Mechanism and its successor funding, the Loss and Damage Fund. The environmental as well as the economic values of breastfeeding are substantial, but are mostly not measured. This invisibility distorts public policy and investment priorities towards what is measured. More is urgently needed to avoid further harm to the health of humans and to the health of the planet. So thank you. I hope you've enjoyed this learning lab, and I hope you enjoy our papers. They're all open access online. If you search our names, you'll find us somewhere online. And I'd like to acknowledge both the support of the people today on the team from ANH, and in terms of the tool, I'd like to acknowledge the support of teams at Alive and Thrive and the ANU in developing the green feeding tool, and also the mother's milk tool. For those of you that are interested, do a Google search and you'll find that too. So thank you very much, and we'll close now, I think.